but most of these are not intended to be analyzed in any detail. They are primarily showing trend lines and so on to sort of build the larger argument I can be making tonight about the energy transition. Just as a way of bit of background, I came from the West Coast. I did my undergrad at UBC. I grew up in the lower mainland of Vancouver, and I moved out to the East Coast initially to do my master's degree in the late 1980s, and I did a master's in environmental studies at Dal, and it was at that time I started to cue into these issues a little bit, and the climate change issue, for example, was just starting to get a lot of serious discussion with a major report published in 1988, and then that picked up steam with the Rio Summit and so on, in the first negotiating of the Framework Convention and so on in the early 90s and after. I then took some time off and lived and worked overseas for a few years in the Philippines and in the Caribbean, and went back and did a PhD at Rutgers in New Jersey in human ecology. And my primary research interest in terms of specializations has been focused more on tropical human ecology, forest use, land use change, and so on in southern countries, tropical environments. But as somebody who's a generalist by nature, and also I was hired at Mount A in the fall of 1999, so 21 years ago, and I was hired as the coordinator of environmental studies, so I had to teach courses of a fairly general nature from the get-go. And so I intuitively knew way back then, 20 years ago, that the climate issue was a looming sort of critical issue, and that the only way to address it was through a massive mobilization of renewable energy and so on, and a complete sort of restructuring of our energy system. So I knew it was going to be sort of the big issue of the century in a way back then even. So I started to follow it quite carefully, the developments in the science and the developments in the technology. So even though I'm not, for example, an engineer by training, and some of the questions you may put at me, I may not be able to answer, but I have followed the developments in renewable energy and the larger policy issues and political issues surrounding climate change now pretty carefully for about 20 years. And it's from that vantage that I can say to you that it's only in the last year or two that I've really started to come to see that we are at a critical turning point here, or a tipping point, I should say. I think many people, for good reason, have been frustrated and cynical and at times despairing about the future, given the increasing evidence and the evidence and seriousness of climate change on the one hand, and the relative failure of governments and the private sector on the other to actually deal with it. And I, for one, if you talked to me 10, 12, 14 years ago, I was really profoundly concerned for a while, about this. But I will say, in all honesty, I'm now more optimistic, despite all the increasing mountain of evidence that climate change is here and that it's going to be serious. I'm actually more optimistic today than I have been for many, many years about the future. And that's because I see we seem to have finally reached a point where the changes that need to be made technologically and so on are for the first time actually within practical reach. And by practical, I mean we have the technologies, the cost of the technologies has come down enough now that it's realistic to talk about scaling them up, at a massive level around the world. And we've ironed out a lot of the technical bugs, so to speak, that were preventing us from really moving aggressively forward in this direction, as well as we've seemed to have also turned to somewhat of a political corner in the last year or two on these issues, where the deniers are finally sort of being pushed out of the picture. And there seems to be this broad-based mobilization and recognition that this is a mightily important issue and needs to be maintained as a priority, not something that's going to slip away from the political agenda as it has in the past. And I really feel like there is this kind of coalescing of the politics, the technology, and so on in a way that suggests we really are at a point in history. Historians are going to look back in 40 years and say, it was right around 2018 to 2022, 23, where things just kind of flipped and started going to really high gear. And that's kind of what I'm going to get at tonight in the talk, to try and build an argument to that effect. Now, we all know what a problem fossil fuels are. If you're an environmentalist, you know that they are not only the source of climate change, the combustion of fossil fuels, but burning fossil fuels is the source of many of our worst environmental problems, period. Not just climate change, but land and habitat degradation, toxic pollution issues, whether you're looking at heavy metals, smog, acid rain, marine, oil, and plastic pollutions, and even noise pollution. Think of how much noise that's out there in the world that is the result of the internal combustion engine blasting away every time you go outside. So I tell people that when we address the climate issue by transitioning away from fossil fuels, we're actually going to solve a whole range of other major environmental problems that we've been dealing with for over a century, ever since we started burning coal on a large scale. That doesn't mean we're going to have, we will have other problems that will come from scaling up renewables on a massive scale, but I think that those problems will be ultimately fairly manageable. So the most important question here is, can we transition quickly enough to an alternative energy future based on the widespread deployment of new energy technologies? Now, I can't answer that question yet because we don't know how fast and hard climate changes are going to come. There could be some real surprises in the near future that throw things out of whack. But at the same time, as I said, if you'd asked me this question 3, 4, 5 years ago, I would have said probably not. But now I'm saying, no, you know what? I'm now increasingly confident that we can win this battle, right? But some general points to keep in mind here. First of all, we should not underestimate just how difficult it is to make the transition away from fossil fuels to greener alternatives. I mean, this is a mistake that most environmentalists have always made. They assume that the green transition, the elimination of fossil fuels, the scaling up of wind and solar and whatnot was relatively straightforward, and all that was needed was political will or a culture change. And the one thing I've learned watching this issue play out now for 3 decades is that view is incredibly naive. I mean, transforming the energy infrastructure that essentially has brought us modern civilization is the biggest technological, policy, political, and social challenge that the world has arguably ever faced. And it involves enormous amounts of work by enormous segments of society, as well as massive amounts of investment and technical innovation and so on to make it happen. Okay, so this is the main reason why this problem has been slow to solve. It isn't because we haven't lacked the political will, although that's part of it. It isn't because the technology wasn't there. That's part of it. It was because, again, that a combination of things hadn't yet come together, and important breakthroughs in the technology and the cost of technology hadn't yet happened to make it practical to happen. But after decades of very slow progress, we appear to be finally at a genuine tipping point. It will still take a lot of time. This isn't going to happen overnight. We're talking now several decades of work here. But again, if you look at the prognosis, if you go back 5, 10 years ago and look at the International Energy Agency or various other technical groups that predicted when these changes were going to happen, they were pushing the predicted changes for widespread uptake of renewables and green cars and that, talking about way ahead, from where we're at now. And all of those agencies are now have been fastly moving up their future scenarios, right? So I'm going to focus on 2 primary areas: power generation and then later electric cars. There's a number of renewable options here. I'm not going to talk about nuclear. That's also fairly clean burning from a climate change point of view. I'm not going to get into that, but Canada in particular is a superpower when it comes to hydro. Again, I don't want to get into all the details of these things, just to point out that we've already mobilized an enormous amount of hydro resources. 76,000 megawatts of hydro potential is already in place in this country. That's a heck of a lot of power. It's the reason why the electricity grids in many of our provinces are already quite low carbon, by the way. And there's some potential to expand that. But I think that, what is becoming apparent is we won't need to invest too much more in hydro, I think, because the other technologies that are coming down the pipes are actually in many respects going to be cheaper and more efficient to build into the grids than simply continuing to try and expand hydro, as we see with like the Muskrat Falls case and the Site C Dam in BC. These big projects are expensive. They're environmentally impacting in their own way. And in the end of the day, I don't think you're going to see a heck of a lot more of those big mega hydro projects in Canada. We've already got a lot of them, though. Geothermal, I'm not going to dwell on this. It has an interesting set of potential. I think for some countries, there's a lot of opportunity to scale geothermal in a really big way. I think for Canada, it's still ultimately would be too expensive to scale up geothermal to the level where it actually had some real impacts on the challenges we're dealing with. But who knows? It's something. There's a lot of geothermal resources out there. It's just very it's very expensive to build it out in a way that actually makes financial sense. We've got hydropower resources in our backyard here that are unmatched in the world. But the technical challenges of making this work have been really tricky. I don't know what the current status of the Fundy hydro tidal power projects is. They did a lot of experimentation. They put in some different models there, and found that the technical challenges of making these things work was actually more complicated than people thought. In particular, because the power of the tides is just an enormous physical thing to deal with when you're building things underwater, and combined with the fact that there's a lot of sediment in the water, so that has a scouring effect, et cetera, et cetera. So it's unclear whether tidal power is really going to take off or not. I was more optimistic that it was going to take off a few years ago. It seems to be in a sort of stalled phase at the moment, but we'll see if they do crack the nut on this. The potential power source of the Bay of Fundy alone is enormous. Here was a model, one of the in-stream tidal power turbines they put in a couple of years ago. But it gets more interesting when you move into things like wind and solar. Now, we all know that wind has expanded tremendously in the last couple of decades. You travel around the country and you see wind farms all over the place. This is again in our backyard here, the Tantramar wind farm. Canada has, I would say, done reasonably well on the wind power front, but are hardly at the leaders on this. There are European countries, Denmark, Spain, Portugal, Scotland, the UK, and others Germany that have embraced wind and now generate quite significant portions of their overall electricity from wind power in their grids. Canada, again, it varies a lot from province to province. Ontario, Quebec, Alberta have quite a lot of wind. Nova Scotia and PEI, for their size, are actually fairly significant wind players. New Brunswick, less so. Lots of room to grow here. That's my general point. 13,000 megawatts is nothing to sneeze at, but there's lots and lots of room to grow. And I'll add some additional comments on that in a few minutes. So here's a trend line of our onshore installed wind capacity, and you can see the growth rate was significant. I mean, most of the wind that we have installed now was installed in the last 10 years. Okay, so before that, Canada had relatively little wind power. We've now got a fair bit, but again, I think that especially because we've got the tremendous hydro resources we have that can provide base load power, I don't know why we are not a lot more ambitious on the wind power front, because countries that don't have the same luxury of abundant hydropower, like again, Portugal and Spain and Scotland are nonetheless, and Germany have scaled up wind to a much higher extent of the energy grid than Canada has in any of its provinces. So there's lots of room to grow there. Globally, wind power just really, again, exploded in the last 10 years. This is a rate of growth that is quite astonishing. When you look at it, it's an exponential kind of growth rate, more or less. And if it keeps going like this, wind is going to be form an increasingly significant part of our power systems around the world. In 2018, there was 591,000 megawatts installed. That's a lot of power. The entire power system of New Brunswick is around 3,500 megawatts. So 590,000 megawatts, and that's 2018. I don't have the most recent statistics, but it's well past 650,000 now. So that's a lot of power, but it's still only a small fraction of the world's energy source because the world consumes so much power, right? And if you look at the history of wind power deployment, it follows a fairly strong pattern here, where at the point at which wind power started to come down significantly in cost, it hit a key sort of economic point where it became close to cost competitive with alternative energy sources. And now in recent years, it's actually among one of the cheapest sources of power in many jurisdictions around the world. And that includes wind backed up with battery storage. So we've reached a point, not everywhere in the world, but in many parts of the world, where if a power company decides it wants more power added to the grid, the lowest cost bids are coming at them often from wind, and in some cases wind with battery backup capacity. Okay, so this is, again, the economics of wind are now beating out, well, they started beating out coal a number of years ago, but they're now beating out natural gas in places. So it's a really interesting story with wind. But again, the key thing, there has been policy pressure and incentives in place in a number of countries for a number of years to encourage the uptake of wind. But ultimately, wind didn't really take off globally until the price came down and became practically competitive with alternative sources, okay? And wind is a simple technology until you realize all the interesting things going on, the engineers are working on. I thought, what is there? You got a turbine, so you can make it a little bigger, a little, spin a little faster, whatever. But there's all kinds of interesting engineering developments happening in the wind industry that are making these things more efficient and, as a result, less costly. And one of the most interesting developments is the size of these turbines, which have exploded in size. What we have in our backyard in Tantramar here is, I believe, the wind turbines there are 1.8 megawatts. So they're a little below 2 megawatts. Well, guess what? In the last year, the General Electric has come out with models of wind turbine, as well as another company, I think it's a South Korean company, that are pushing up to 12, 14 megawatts each, right? And I read something recently where there is serious work being done by a couple, wind power companies where they're in the heavy development, including GE, I believe. And they're actually genuinely talking about wind turbines that are going to be 50 megawatts each at some point. 50 megawatts a piece. That's roughly 30 times the individual power being produced by one of these turbines that we have in the Tantramar, right? And the engineering involved in this is extraordinary when you think about the size of these things and the forces that they're being subject to. But what's a key part of the development that's happening in the wind power industry in the world right now is its movement offshore. So the really big turbines are being designed specifically for offshore. The first offshore turbines that went in, I mean, it's expensive to build offshore to begin with. So it makes economic sense. If you're going to build offshore, you got to build them big to begin with. So the early offshore turbines were, 3, 4 megawatts. Then they moved to sort of 6 megawatts, then to 8, and then the GE Halide, 12, 14 megawatt turbines are already being built and installed in Europe. And the United States along the eastern seaboard is poised to actually to explode in terms of offshore wind power development. They took a long time to get their act together. This is a kind of common story of America, right? They seem to take a long time to get their act together. But now that the Americans have finally fully embraced it in a sort of economic and regulatory sense, they're talking about going from relatively zero offshore wind power to 30,000 megawatts of offshore wind power in just the coming decade, right? And this is being made possible in part because of these massive turbines, which are incredibly efficient. And when you build them offshore, they're away from land, but the winds offshore are steadier. You build them higher, the winds are stronger. So you add all this up and you end up with systems that are much, much more efficient. And in the greater scheme of things, it's hard to believe that these would be cost effective, given you think, oh my God, the work involved with anchoring these things into the ground, or in some cases they can actually buoy them in the water. But guess what? This is, what's happening with this is they're actually using the infrastructure, the ships, and a lot of the technology that they used for offshore oil and gas development. And it's being redeployed to build these massive offshore wind farms. But these things are massive already, like in scale off the coast of Scotland, Denmark, Germany. We're already talking about thousands and thousands of megawatts installed capacity offshore. The weird thing is Canada, to my knowledge, doesn't have a single offshore turbine. And I can't figure that, especially on the East Coast here, where we've got lots of coastline, but also lots of relatively shallow coastline, and I just don't understand why Canada, the eastern provinces haven't just totally jumped into this and said, because every megawatt of renewable energy power that we can produce is going to be gladly welcomed south of the border because of the policies on the books now to shift towards renewables in states like New York and the rest of New England, right? So in any case, that's a really interesting thing. Solar, of course, is exciting. Solar is actually more exciting than wind, okay? So I just told you a really good news story about wind and how the cost came down and da. Well, guess what? Solar, which everybody was saying was going to be a power of the future. 10 years ago, people said, well, maybe solar will be cost competitive in 2040. And then they started saying, well, maybe, 7 years ago, 2030. And now they're like, well, guess what? That example I gave you of the power companies accepting bids for low cost energy, well, increasingly solar projects are coming out and beating coal, beating natural gas, and even beating wind power. And why this is so exciting is because wind power is kind of, highly varied where you can exploit it efficiently. Offshore, great. In windy areas like the Great Plains, great. But to an extent, wind is limited geographically in where it'll work well. And it's also highly variable because of the winds. The potential of solar is much greater. There is harvestable solar resources practically everywhere in the world. And as they've figured out how to bring the cost down in solar voltaics and other related systems, that too has reached the point where you've got an explosion now of solar power installation happening worldwide. It ain't very obvious around here yet, but in many parts of the world, it is solar, not wind, that is dominating now the renewable energy transition. And here's a graph that shows how significant that is. So here's comparing gigawatts of installed capacity every year, and the blue is the wind So blue has been sort of steadily growing, but around 2016, solar just suddenly blew past wind in terms of the amount of net installed capacity going in. And by 2020, their predictions are that, solar is just going to be dominating in many places the renewable energy investments. And you can see here, now this is showing the cumulative amount of installed capacity. And I showed you a graphic earlier showing that, there was about, in 2018, there was 592,000 gigawatts of wind. And in 2018, solar came out of nowhere and blew past wind in 2019, 2020. And some of these figures are forecast, but I've seen the 2020 statistics, and that are pretty consistent with this. And again, it's just essentially blowing past wind, pardon the pun. And solar is amazing because you can install solar almost everywhere in the world, and it is becoming increasingly cost effective that way. Obviously, it's best to do it in hot, sunny places like Arizona. But even in far less solar ideal locations, solar is reaching this point where it's cost competitive with the alternatives. And this is the breakthrough stuff I'm talking about that makes all the difference. Power companies in the United States, including in Republican states, red states, these are states that are full of people who don't believe in climate change, and they don't have climate change on the agenda in terms of policy leadership. But if you look at many of those states now, they've become leaders in renewable energy. And the reason is simple, because their power policies require that power companies that provide power to the citizens by law are required to go with the lowest cost bids. And in the last, in the last 8 years or so, wind power bids have been coming in at the lowest level. But in the last 2 or 3 years, it's the solar projects that are coming in, beating out everything else. So these states that are, deep red states in some cases, like Texas and Wyoming and Dakota and South Dakota, the cradle of the oil and gas industry, they've got flourishing renewable energy sectors now. And it's the economics that's bringing that on. Globally, investment in clean energy, grew and grew and grew. It's now been over $300 billion a year. It isn't growing notably really, really fast at this point, but it's important to realize that as the renewable energies become more efficient, that for every $1 billion you invest, in a sense, you're installing more of that energy source. So the same $1 billion in 2010 might have given you, 10 gigawatts. Now it's giving you 20 gigawatts. So that investment graph is misleading. It actually underestimates how much the net addition to the grid that's happening. And here's another interesting example of when I'm talking about energy transitions. Coal is the worst, right? It's highly inefficient, CO2 polluting, but also puts all kinds of garbage out there, SO2, mercury, lead, nitrous oxide emission, you name it. Coal is the absolute worst thing we should be using. The United States in 2000, 2005, 2010 was among the world's largest consumers of coal. 50% of the power in the electrical power in the United States came from coal. That was only 10 years ago. Now it's down to like 20%. Now, the reason for this change is partly because coal is dirty and regulations are tightening the screws on it. But as I said, even more important, coal is just not cost competitive anymore. It's being beat out by natural gas. That's one reason for this decline. But as you can see, it's also being beat out increasingly by renewables. So we're talking in 10 years, the United States has retired hundreds of coal-fired generating plants, hundreds. And that downward trend continued under Trump as well as Obama. Obama was pushing on the regulations. Trump was doing the opposite. He was trying to keep coal alive, and still coal kept tanking. And again, the reason being because the economics are crappy with coal. It's just simply no longer viable as an alternative. So transportation is the other thing, and in many ways, transportation is even blowing more mind blowing than the other things I've been talking about in terms of the speed at which this thing has caught up and suddenly taken the world by surprise. Because we've been talking about fuel cells and electric cars for decades, right? But then something happened a few years ago. I don't know when it was, 3-4 years ago. There started to be a lot of talk about battery prices coming down. And then there were these really crazy innovators like Elon Musk who were pushing the boundaries of the technology and the markets and all this stuff. And everybody was counting these guys out. I mean, if you go back, Elon Musk's an asshole. He's an egomaniac. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a dreamer. He's not going to succeed. Everybody was counting this guy out. And now Tesla is the most highly capitalized market car company in the world in the matter of just a few years. And he's been bringing all of these innovative models into the marketplace. But what's happening with Tesla is that's a company that's on the leading edge. But really, the really interesting things is what has been happening now in the other car companies that woke up about 2 years ago to this electric car revolution, which everybody been sort of playing with and toying with in the back of their minds for years. There'd been a few models put out there, mostly experimental. They didn't sell very much. And then boom, Tesla came along and demonstrated to the world that not only is it possible, but these cars are superior, and started eating up market share. Concerns over climate change were kicking in. But the important thing again is the cost. The battery, the most expensive component of electric cars that had to come down to make them competitive cost-wise with internal combustion engines is the batteries. And battery costs have dive-bombed in the last 5 years. And this has led to a sudden surge in electrical purchasing, and predictions now are just off the charts. And again, I tell you, reading Bloomberg Energy 4 or 5 years ago, they were talking about electric cars being something that would really take off in the 2030s. Now look at these projections. They're talking now, oh no, the electric car revolution is more or less arrived. And it's now just a matter of scaling up the production, because consumers are indicating that they want these damn things. That electric cars globally, electric car sales grew by 46% in 2020. And that was at a time when overall car sales dropped by 20% in the world, And so all these big car companies are jumping in. Volkswagen announced a couple of years ago that they were going to take $120 billion of investment and redirect it out of everything to do with diesel cars and into all electric, and that they would have 20-30 models on the market by 2022, 23. And other car companies have followed, right? General Motors announced just a few days ago that they're going to stop making internal combustion engine cars and SUVs by 2035. General Motors, for God's sake. This is the company that gave us the gas guzzlers, right? And Ford likewise has made, they haven't made this kind of an explicit commitment, but Ford has got all kinds of all electric models coming on, right? As do Mercedes, as do, all the Chinese have the homegrown car companies that are focusing on all electrics and so on and so forth. And the remarkable thing is just how fast this has happened. I mean, 2 to 3 years ago, it was like the only serious electric car company was Tesla. And nobody was talking. I mean, there was talk, but it was like, and in just 2 to 3 years, it's like all of the world's big automakers, or almost all of them, have just completely shifted their direction and where they're going. And, read the news. This is just some news from the last 3 weeks, right? In addition to the ones I just showed you. Canada invests in electrical grid integration in Nova Scotia. GM Unifor reach a tentative deal to build electric delivery vans in Ontario. That's now, I think, the third major multi-$100 million investment in Ontario to move auto plants from internal combustion to all electric. Again, that's happening really fast. There was none a year and a half ago. There was nothing, and now I think there's been three major announcements involving these auto companies, basically saying we're going to take this auto plant and we're going to turn it into electric cars. It's going to, $500 million investments. So it's happening, and it's happening faster than anybody would have expected. I mean, I certainly didn't see this coming. I thought, I was more confident in Elon Musk and Tesla than a lot of people were a few years ago. I really sensed he was onto something, but I did not expect how fast that once the wedge was established, that all these other big players would start to fall in and move behind. And this is so important because, as much a leader as somebody like as Tesla has been, they got to build everything from the ground up. So they can only expand production so fast. It's far more important that the big automakers who already have in place, hundreds of auto plants around the world, it's far more important that they retool those plants for all electric, because that can happen much more quickly. And key to all this, again, is the reducing cost. And now they're saying, that all these models of electric cars, they're going to be cost competitive with internal combustion engines by 2022, 2023. I mean, I kid you not. Go back and look at, people predictions from 5 years ago. They were talking about electric cars being cost competitive in the 2030s, and they're already talking now 1 or 2 years down the road. And anybody who knows about cars knows that these are better. These cars have better performance, and they're lower maintenance. So once the cost issue is no longer a factor, everybody's going to be piling into all electrics. It's just going to happen. It is happening now. It's really picking up speed, but give it another 3-4 years, and it'll be just like your auto sales lots will be just full of all electric models, because that's what the consumer is going to want. And this is happening far faster than I could have imagined it was going to happen. So Tesla and Dalhousie Inc. New Deal. A lot of people don't know this, but one of the world's leading battery research groups is at Dalhousie University, and they've been working with Tesla for years, and they just inked a formal agreement to continue their work. Another story that came out of The Guardian a couple of weeks ago, that electric car batteries with 5-minute charging times are being produced now. So they're saying this problem of having to wait for a long time to charge your battery, they're saying, no, in a few more years, we're going to solve that. Just like they've solved the range anxiety problem. 5 years ago, the only car you could get, if you didn't want to pay, $200,000 for it, the only car you could get would have a range of 120 kilometers. Well, I mean, now it's just a no-brainer. They don't sell electric cars that are less than 200 kilometer ranges. And the new models that are coming from Volkswagen and General Motors are all going to deliver 300-400 kilometer hour ranges on one charge, and they're doing this at a cost that's going to be a lot cheaper than the cars from 5 years ago that only had 100 kilometer hour charges. So again, these are absolutely earthquake level kinds of changes that are happening, and they're happening. Every second day I open and read the news, there's something else happening on the alternative energy electric car front or something like that, right? Nova Scotia finally got Muskrat Falls electricity, a little late, but that's important. Building this Atlantic loop, it gives us some additional base load power that can allow not only Nova Scotia to reduce its consumption of coal, but that base load power is important for moving more into renewables like wind and solar. And then, BlackRock, which is the world's largest investor, has basically gone full on divestment, climate, all this stuff. And things are changing in a big way when the big investors in Wall Street are saying, I want my money to go into climate friendly businesses. I mean, holy mackerel. Who could have saw that coming even 2 years ago, right? Anyways, so just to conclude here, because I want to leave some time for questions, political leadership has been very important in laying the foundations of this. If you look at the history of the renewable energy and stuff like that, investments in R&D from governments, regulations on fossil fuels, and more importantly, incentivizing the uptake of renewables, first in Germany and other parts of Europe, then in China, in certain states in California, for example, places like that. The policy, the political leadership and the policy stuff really helped to move these things forward at a time when they were really expensive. And so to get the innovation and the investment in it happen. But what's changed that's so important now is the economics. It's that renewables are now cost comparative, if not cheaper, than non-renewable sources of power, and electric powered cars are going to be cheaper than internal combustion cars in a few years. And it therefore just no longer makes economic sense to pick the fossil fuel option, right? And that's why I say we're here. The energy transition is here. It's just a question of how fast it's going to go. Nothing's going to stop this at this point. It just is, because it simply doesn't make any sense anymore. Whether or not you care about the environment, it doesn't make any sense to go with the fossil fuel options anymore from an economic point of view. So anyways,
thanks, Brad. That's great. We did have quite a few questions and comments in the chat box. So I don't think we have time for all of them, but I am just gonna pick a couple. And a couple people have sort of mentioned nuclear power, especially, you know, the small modular nuclear reactors that are being talked about for New Brunswick. And I just wondered if you had any comments about any of that sort of thing.
Asset, although I'm not surprised they were, because there's a big buzz about that. And so, you know, some of my students in my policy class last term were looking at that, for example. You know, on the one hand, I think climate change is so serious a problem that we should have an all hands on deck attitude and not rule out anything, and knowing that, again, the climate problem may be so bad in a decade or two that we're going to be scrambling to deal with any kind of way to decarbonize. So I wouldn't put anything off the table. But that said, I simply don't know enough about the small scale stuff to comment, because I've heard a number of people, like one of my students made a quite convincing case that it was a good thing. But then I've also heard people say, you know, this is a terrible idea for various reasons. And I just don't know enough. The thing about nuclear, it's one of those things that people have such a hard time just kind of looking at rationally at it and assessing the risks without getting really kind of freaked out about the worst case scenarios. But that said, again, like, I think that we should not shut down the existing nuclear plants we have ahead of schedule. I think we need them. That's not so much important for Canada, although it is here. But in the United States, like, they have a lot of nuclear power that they would be unwise to shut down, because that's going to enable them to scale up renewables much faster, because they've got the base load, and it would be really reckless to shut down the nuclear that they have. But whether these small scale nuclear things have a significant future, I really don't want to say, but I think it's worth investing in R&D to find out. You know, that's the one thing I would say.
Yeah, the thing that it seems to me that the small modular nuclear reactors are just so hypothetical at this point, and the amount of money and time that it's going to take, you know, like, I was listening to a webinar and they were saying, oh yeah, like, hopefully in 8 or 10 years, we're going to have like a prototype. And I was sort of thinking, like, you know, I don't know if we have that amount of time to wait.
It's not, you know, if it works out, if it turns out that it's a reasonable technology, can be done safely, can make use of secondary fuels that have already come out of existing power plants, et cetera, maybe it will be a really significant source of low carbon power in the future. But you're absolutely right. Like, we can't be banking our carbon targets on that happening. We've got to get to work now, and every way we can. And if we've already got proven technologies that are cost effective and scalable and so on, then we should be supporting those full on for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Some people had some questions about wind turbines, and I don't know if you know the answers. Someone was asking about their capacity, like the very large, the very tall ones, their capacity to withstand like strong and frequent hurricanes.
You know, I'm not often impressed by engineers. Like engineers are kind of like I think that they're overrated in a lot of ways. We always knew how to build houses before engineers came along. The Romans built bridges and that before they had all the physics and math figured out. But aeronautical engineering is fascinating, and anything to do with flight and so on. And wind power is like an off growth of aeronautical engineering. And what they are able to do is just astonishing to me, because I can't understand how these wind turbines up here in Amherst withstand the brutal weather that they do. I don't know how they met. I mean, it has to do with the design. It also has the ability to control. Like, there's a point at which if they're spinning too fast, they can slow them down and stuff like that. But how they can then talk about building turbines that are 3 times, 4 times taller with individual blades that are 80, 90, 100 meters long, individual blades. And these future ones you're talking about are going to be, and yet put those offshore in where the weather is just brutal. You got ice, you got salt, you got wind, you get waves. And yet they're saying they can do this, and they're already doing it. I mean, they've already built out lots of really big turbines in the North Sea, in off the coast of Germany, Scotland, right? And they're not falling apart. So my goodness, how they do this is beyond me. It has a lot to do with the materials. They have to have a certain flex in them so that they bend but don't break, et cetera, et cetera. But it's absolutely fascinating engineering. If I was going to be an engineer, and I'm not, and I would never be an engineer because I'm not really a math geek. But if I was, I think that's what the field I'd want to work in, because I just think it's so interesting what they're doing.
For sure. Yeah, no, that's super cool. Yeah, so Eric has a question. I don't know, Eric, if maybe I'll just read it. That might be easier. Take me too much time to figure it out. So Eric Tusking was saying, when you keep saying the economics are better, you're really saying that it's cheaper. He says one of the challenges will be who owns the generation of electricity, and will they be conscious of the social environmental impacts of massive manufacturing in wind and solar?
Well, you're right. There's economics, and then there's political economy, if you want to call it, the interaction between the politics and the economics. And for the massive spread and upscaling to happen, the costs have to come down, so they have to be cost competitive or better. But there are other things that are more political that can still get in the way of a full embrace on this. And you're right to raise that. Who owns the power generating capacity? Whether it's a crown corporation, and who's calling the shots there. The political pressures being brought to bear to keep existing fossil fuel infrastructure operating, right? I mean, this is a big problem with, say, Beldoon and so on, where there are jobs that will be lost when that closed down, and in part of the province where they're already struggling with job loss. So there's a lot of political pressure to just keep it open for that reason, right? So it ain't just pure economics that's relevant. My point was more just that the economics had to work before the transition could really take hold. And the second part of that, I think, was about so that concerns over socioeconomic or social environmental effects of large scale production are properly brought into it. Again, that's always going to be a challenge with any kind of development, the degree to which we minimize those kinds of negative impacts, but at the same time recognizing that impacts are inevitable, right? and you can't have impact-free development. And the question I always put to people who say, "Oh, we shouldn't have, we should contain the number of wind farms," say, well, climate change is going to destroy everything, that we hold dear, right? Including us, right? Like if we don't get climate change under control, it's just, the future is going to be so bloody bleak. So the idea that we're unwilling to accept, say, wind turbines in my backyard, because I think that kind of thinking is it's too widespread. Now, fortunately, I think solar power, because one of the nice things about solar is that of all the renewable energy sources that are likely to play a key role, solar doesn't pose quite the same level of local opposition and impact that, say, even wind turbines do. So that's good news. In other words, people, I think, will be much more willing to accept, say, a solar power farm out in the Tantramar instead of another wind farm, that kind of thing. So again, that's good news. But building out solar, building out all these batteries for cars and that, there's going to be massive upscaling of mining for key minerals like cobalt and lithium and all that kind of stuff. And it's going to have impacts. Let's hope that our governments regulate those impacts as well as they can, but you're going to have impacts. And fortunately, again, even in those areas, like the construction of the manufacture of batteries and things like that, and solar panels, over time, their components are becoming more and more environmentally friendly. And they're now talking, I don't know how realistic this is, but they're talking about next generation batteries is not even requiring lithium and so on. And maybe, so that's a future that, wouldn't that be nice? That we can get to a point where we're running all this stuff and the environmental impacts are really remarkably minimized like that. But that's, again, a whole other set of issues.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I guess so. So Brian Beaton was asking, and I know this has come up quite a bit, because it seems like in New Brunswick, like I said, there's a lot of push on towards nuclear. And I don't know, I guess the economics of it or the cost hasn't seemed to affect, like you were saying, how it's so much cheaper and stuff like that.
Well, I think the case of the attraction of the nuclear stuff in New Brunswick is another example of other factors that influence these kinds of decisions that are not just straight economics. And NB Power, because of Point Lepreau, there is this existing in-house capacity in the province for nuclear research, technology, engineering, and all that. And so I think that there is a certain amount of political support for sustaining that and building upon it. And who knows, right? Maybe in 30 years from now, we'll all be glad that they did this, because maybe small scale nuclear will turn out to be really good and widespread. And maybe, New Brunswick would be a major producer of these technologies. We just don't know. There's a real technological gamble going on here. And I think a lot of people are frustrated. They're thinking, well, why would we put all our eggs in that when we're not, we could put it elsewhere. Like, one of the things I would say is, well, as I said earlier, why are all the maritime provinces? I haven't heard any conversations about offshore wind, and I don't get it. Like, it's absolutely going to explode south of the border, and it's already exploding in Europe. It's exploding in Asia, coastal Asia, China, and South Korea. It's just massively expanding, and that's happening because the economics of it are very attractive, and it has impacts, but the impacts are less in most respects than they would be if they're building that out on land. So there are lots of pluses for offshore wind, yet I have not heard any official conversations about it. There must be some talk, but it surprises that none of the maritime provinces have been saying, hey, let's get into offshore wind. Let's think about strategically about offshore wind. Like, I just don't hear any conversation of that. And then they're talking about small scale nuclear, and offshore wind is a no-brainer. That's already proven technology to work, and we could have a really thriving industry, I think, if we got ahead of the curve in that. The nuclear thing is a much bigger gamble. But again, there are other forces at work and at play there. And I'm not going to say it's a terrible idea to be supporting that. As I said, I think there's an all hands on deck thing that's needed here. But I would have liked to have seen, okay, if you want to throw some effort into the small scale nuclear, see what happens. It's a longer term thing, but why the heck are you not also then exploring these other options that in a sense are much more feasible right now with existing technology?
Yeah, for sure. No, I totally agree. Well, it's 8:01. So thanks so much, Brad. I really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for tuning in. I wasn't able to get to all of your questions, but I can certainly, pass them along and we can see if we can get some more answered. So yeah, thanks so much. Take care and have a great evening.
Yeah, thanks for everybody for attending. I really think this is a great sort of format for doing this kind of thing.
Yep. No, it's great to have this option during a pandemic for sure. All right, everybody. Take care. Bye.